Hello, everybody. Welcome to another recording for History Valley Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor James Tabor, and today we're going to be discussing his views on a two-document hypothesis, the idea that Mark is the first gospel, Matthew and Luke independently borrowed from Mark, but they also borrowed from another document called Q, which is supposed to explain the double tradition passages in Luke and Matthew and their alternating primitivity. With that being said, welcome back to the podcast, James Tabor.
Okay, so you ready to go? We'll do it.
Let's do it.
Yeah. What I like to do, Jacob, is present the data, not the theory. So I'm going to show some slides. I do have a slide or two on the theory. Many of your viewers will know this anyway, because you've had Matthew priority, probably had Luke, you've had every possible theory. And you've had a lot of people with different views. So what I want to do first is to show the data. I'm actually presenting what I often do in my own university classes to introduce students who don't know anything. And then I will go into these actual texts that I've chosen. So I'm going to, if it's okay with you, I'll go ahead and share the screen and we'll get going. Okay. So I've got to scroll back to the beginning. So the traditional, you can see that okay, Jacob? Is that good for everybody? Yeah. And can you see my little cursor moving?
Yes, I do.
Good, because I might need that to point. Okay, I just need to adjust one thing on my screen because something's blocked. Okay, so before I even get into the slides, you can see me, even though I'm probably a little thumbnail. I really recommend this book. I don't have the cover on it, but it's called Gospel Parallels by Throckmorton. It's one of the cheaper ones. You can get it just about anywhere. And as you can see there, it gives you Matthew, Mark, and Luke in parallel. It puts Matthew on the left, Mark in the middle, and Luke on the right. And I insist all my students have that because it really does. And so if you see the two source tradition, it's right there, two. If sometimes Mark is also, shouldn't be parallel to the two source if we're going to have a pure theory, but sometimes there's a little bit of Mark and you go, how did that get there? So we'll see examples of that. The other one that is actually still pretty reasonable because it's subsidized by the American Bible Society. And as you can see, this is all four. So even though John is not going to be always parallel, you get John, as you go along, there's John as well. And it becomes pretty interesting. But I like concentrating on what are called the synoptics. I think most of your viewers know we're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then John being usually the fourth gospel. The traditional views, as you know, a lot of them come from Eusebius, the church historian. I highly recommend this version of Eusebius. It's University of California Press, and it's translated by Jeremy Schott, Schott. You can get it on Amazon or any bookseller. And it's really, really nicely done as a translation. Some of those old translations online, or even the Loeb that a lot of people use, they're very archaic, out of date. And Jeremy's a new modern scholar. Scholar. He's at the University of Indiana. He used to be at Charlotte. I hired him actually when he got his PhD. He came right out of grad school and was in our department at UNC Charlotte. But he got picked up by a bigger school because he's such a brilliant guy, I guess. So anyway, Eusebius says, it's just a very traditional view that makes you feel good as a believer or something. Eusebius is promoting his Christianity. Matthew is written by Matthew, one of the 12 apostles. Mark is written by a guy named Mark, but he's Peter's interpreter. This is based a lot on Papias, as you know. And Luke is Paul's interpreter. So there you go. You've got, the true word coming from an apostle who was there, eyewitness. Mark, who basically got it from Peter, so that's sort of eyewitness. And then we get Paul doing Luke Acts. Obviously, scholars today don't buy into those, generally speaking. And basically all the all the possibilities have been tried. So the theory I'm going to present to you is often called the two-source Griesbach hypothesis, sometimes four sources, because you do have material that Matthew has uniquely and Luke has uniquely. I'll show you a chart in a minute. But there is the idea that Matthew wrote first. You've had programs on that, and people do defend it. And Mark would be a kind of reduced or cut down version of Matthew, derivative of Matthew. And Luke would also use Matthew. I'm also interested in the Jerusalem school, Robert Lindsay, who's gone now, but passed away a few years ago, but lots of followers, Hebrew University connected. And they really defend Lucan priority it's a complicated theory, but just I put it here because you could go like Markan priority, Matthean priority, and Lucan priority, and you can find pretty intense arguments by all three positions. So I think that's important to recognize. None of us have a monopoly on saying, oh, this is the view and you have to have this view, or, you're stupid. So one thing I want to point out, though, is that when scholars do the kind of critical work I'm going to suggest to you and what I do with my students, harmonizing is what a lot of people think when they buy these books like Throckmorton or the Four Gospels. Parallel is a better word. Harmonizing implies that you're putting things together and making one. And I would argue very blatantly that if you harmonize, you destroy the text. Because if you put them all together, you no longer have Mark. Now, I'm mentioning an author here, Kermit Zarley, you see at the top. He has a book. I think it's still in print, but if it isn't, you can find copies. I recommend it. I even have my students get it. Why? Because I want to show them why we're not doing this, and I need to see why we're not in my class. So you can see here's page 29 of his book, and he's doing John the Baptist preparing the way, opening of Mark. And what he does is he puts in John and anything Luke has and anything Matthew has. And if you go into the baptism, you'll even see more. For example, in Matthew, John protests, oh, I can't possibly baptize you. You should be baptizing me, Mark doesn't have that. John doesn't even have the baptism, although the figure of John refers to I saw the Holy Spirit coming down on this guy. So I would point out to my students and to all of your viewers that this could be helpful because you get everything. And I've talked to Kermit. He's my friend. He's a professional golfer, by the way. I think he's retired, but he's a great guy. I love him as a person. He's wonderful. And he sees this as a benefit because if somebody's reading the Bible and they get Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of all together. So that's the traditional harmony of the Gospels. And what critical scholars do, let me define critical as careful rather than like tearing down. Like I'm not tearing down anything. What I'm going to do as I show you these next slides is look carefully at what one says, what another says, how they compare, and so forth. And I think that's the method we use in the academy. For me, it yields more, as you know, because you've promoted it for us. I have a course on the Gospel of Mark. It's just Mark. I want to hear Mark as Mark, almost like you have somebody and stand up and say, okay, tell me your story. Then we go to the next guy or the next girl. What's your story? It could be about the same thing, but we're listening to different accounts. And some might know the others, but it's their turn. They're going to be speaking. So that's a kind of a lame example, but you see the idea. So you can call this either the two source or the four source, because we're going to end up with four. But Essentially, it argues, and these dates, by the way, are just traditional dates. I often point out to my students, because they ask, "How, Dr. Tabor, how do you come up with these dates?" And it's frankly pretty arbitrary. Most scholars think if there was a collection of the sayings of Jesus, which we refer to as Q, meaning in German the source, Quelle, that maybe it would be around 50. Okay. And then you think, oh, Mark wrote first. This is the theory. He probably wrote around 70. And then they just jump. Usually, like, oh, Matthew would be 80, and Luke would be 90, and John would be 100. But if you say, well, wait a minute, you say Matthew's 80. What in Matthew says it's 80? Well, it does seem to be later than Mark, according to the content, in my opinion, because it mentions things like the church, the ecclesia, which Mark never mentions, the primacy of Peter, which Mark far from mentions. In fact, Peter's almost the least important and misunderstands Jesus the most, and so forth. So I just put the dates in where people can see these are the traditional dates. So here's the theory, that in the beginning, someone collected together the sayings of Jesus in like a papyri or whatever. I've actually written it out before for my students on a long scroll paper just to see how long it is. It goes depending on your print. I mean, I printed it, not by hand, in English. It's probably about 10 feet long. So think of a rolled up papyrus, and it's mainly the sayings of Jesus, maybe a couple narratives, but primarily sayings of Jesus. So we got Jesus teaching. And then the author of Mark, and I'm just using the names, not for the authors, but the books, whoever that was, whether it's somebody named Mark or not, he decides to give the narrative or the story. So you've got the teachings and the story. And then you can see the logic of Matthew building on that and essentially thinking, wow, Mark, I've got Mark. It's got a really good framework, of the basic gospel story. And I've also got these sayings, which he groups together in 5 blocks primarily. That's his structure. So you see how he's thinking, well, I'll put all this together. And then right here, M, that means all the material that is not from Mark or the Q source, the saying source, that he wants to add as well. So how do you get Q? You get Q by taking Matthew and Luke and removing what they got from Mark and removing what's unique, and what's left is Q. So that's actually a tight definition of Q. Whether it existed or not, that's how you get the 2 source. It's got to be 2. So it has to have, because we don't have it. So the logic is pretty good. I always tell my students, here's how to define Q. It's the material that Matthew and Luke have in common that is not from Mark. And I have them repeat it like a mantra, because they never heard this stuff, many of them. They go like, I've just read the Bible. What is it? So the average Bible reader often has the impression, because it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and this is an intuitive impression that almost everybody gets. I definitely had it as a kid reading the Bible growing up. 10, 12 years old, I don't remember the age, but I thought, I'll read the New Testament. So I read Matthew. Everybody makes it through Matthew. It's the first one, right? And then I got to Mark and I thought, this is like repeating. I've already heard this. Well, guess what? 95% of Mark is put into Matthew. So healing of the paralytic, walking on the sea, the 2 feedings of the multitudes. I've already read it in Matthew. Now I'm reading it in Mark. So it's no surprise to me that until people look in detail, they would assume Matthean priority or Lucan priority, because it seems like Mark is a cut down version, a kind of a synopsis, really. Like, okay, Matthew, you're 28 chapters, but could you give us that without the sayings that you and Luke have, but just the basic story? And that's what Mark supposedly did, but it doesn't really hold up as I see it, and as we're going to see, because when you start looking at Hope that doesn't go off the screen. I think I can see your screen too. Make it as big as we can. When you see them side by side, you begin to see that how it flows, and that's what we'll get into. But let me start with just like opening of Mark and opening of Matthew. Good place to start. Now in Matthew, it's already chapter 3 because Mark does not have any virgin birth, Joseph and Mary going to Bethlehem, the wise men. None of that is there. Let's start with Mark. He just says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah. And then he introduces John the Baptist in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of forgiveness for the remission of sins, and everybody coming out and being baptized. Okay, if you go with my theory, so kind of work with me on this and see if it works for you. So Matthew's sitting down. He's already told the virgin birth, the wise men, the birth of Jesus, the genealogy in chapter 1. So he's ready to start his narrative because he's added this new material that's only in his gospel, the birth of Jesus. Luke has the birth of Jesus, but it's a totally different story. Matthew's more from Joseph's viewpoint. So anyway, he likes this. It's like, okay, let's start. Mark has a good opening. But you can see that he's already editing a little bit because he says, as it was spoken by the prophet Isaiah, and he only gives the Isaiah quote. This is Isaiah 40, verse 3. So he realizes when he reads Mark, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way, that is Isaiah. But if I leave it like this, as it is written in Isaiah, behold, I send my messenger, that's not Isaiah. Now, I don't know if he thought it was a mistake or would confuse the reader. In Judaism and among the rabbis, you do this all the time. The main thought is Isaiah, prepare the way in the wilderness. But there's another passage in the Hebrew Bible about Malachi sending a messenger who prepares the way. So the phrase that joins is prepare the way. So you see what he's doing? It's kind of complicated, but what he's saying is Isaiah basically talked about preparing the way. And we also have a passage from Malachi, but he doesn't say Malachi, even though he obviously knows it's from Malachi. And Matthew's like, I'm not going to put that in. Now, it could go the other way. You could have, this is Matthew writing first, and Mark says, Malachi talks about that too. I think I'll put that in. So this one just shows how they cross-edit one way or the other. I think it makes more sense to see Matthew as correcting Mark because he's thinking this is going to confuse people. They're going to go to Isaiah and they're not going to find it. And he says it's written in Isaiah, quote, behold, I send my messenger. That's not Isaiah. He puts it later and identifies it. See, so he moves it. Okay, here's another one. This is just the typical 3 sources, and it has to do with the baptism of Jesus. And I want you to notice, I'm going to shut my door here, Jacob, just a second. We got a guest downstairs. I'm in my office at home. So you can notice here, the first thing I always tell students is just get a visual of the parallel. So we start in Mark over at the left, and it's pretty straightforward. Jesus comes from Nazareth, and he's baptized by John. And when he comes out of the water, he hears the dove comes down. He hears a voice from heaven, you are my beloved son, and you I am well pleased. Now, Matthew begins to have a problem with that because 2 things. First of all, did the voice only speak to Jesus? You are my beloved son? It spoke to him? Or did it speak maybe to the crowd as well? In his tradition, or at least the way he writes it, it's a voice from heaven that's like an announcement. Remember, Mark has a messianic secret where nobody's supposed to know who Jesus is. Matthew's really not particularly interested in that. He starts with the virgin birth and the wise men and Herod, and so there's no secret about Jesus. He even gives his genealogy and calls him the Christ. So But he does have a problem with, wait a minute, if John baptized Jesus, then who's the greater? So he puts in this objection. Now, someone could say, well, what do you mean he made it up? I'm not talking about whether he made it up, whether it was in his tradition. That's not the point. The point is, Mark doesn't have it. Now it's getting lengthened. And this would be something would occur to followers later on, because there are John the Baptist people running around who didn't go to Jesus. We know the Mandeans down to our time as well. And so you have, well, I need to be baptized by you. Well, see, that's not in Mark. And then Luke, as you go on, if you follow this theory, and I'm going to try to convince you that it's the best theory, he doesn't really even have the baptism of Jesus. He says, now when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized and was praying. Now, it could be that he's in the water praying when the Holy Dove comes down, the Holy Spirit is a dove. And he does follow, you are my beloved son, not this is. So he could be aware of Mark. But you see, the idea is, when I say it's not mentioned, it's not a scene of his baptism like here. He's in the water, he comes up, he sees. It's more a narrative of what happened. Jesus came down and he was baptized, and when he was praying, he had this revelation. So he would kind of fit more with Mark. Now here's the best example of the two sources. These are word for word the same, basically in English and in Greek. So you have Luke's tradition and Matthew's. Notice the introduction is different. He said to the multitudes, you brood of vipers. Matthew's more against the religious establishment, so he didn't say the multitudes. He says, when he saw the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he said, you brood of vipers. See how he's sharpening the polemic. You're going to see in the two-source tradition, most of us are convinced that Luke preserves it without embellishment as much. He might embellish a little. We wouldn't know because we don't have another. But when we compare it to Matthew, Matthew is always, this is very close, but you can see Matthew is, if it originally was the multitudes, he's saying, yeah, but the people he really would denounce would be the Pharisees and Sadducees. And that's very typical of Matthew. In chapter 23, he takes one verse of Mark and turns it into an entire chapter. It's one of the longest chapters in Matthew about denouncing the Pharisees. Woe to you, you do this, you do that. It's like a rant. And that obviously is not in Mark. So that's the two source. Here's another example of the two source that's very interesting. In Luke, you've got the idea of this is the blessings, sometimes called the Beatitudes, okay? Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom. Blessed are you that hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you that weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are men when men hate you, and so forth, rejoice. So basically, you got the poor, the hungry, and the persecuted. And you can see that Matthew's version of this is not just poor, like no money, but poor in spirit, and not just mourn, they will be comforted. Not just hungry, but he has mourn, he has meek, he has hunger and thirst after righteousness, he has merciful, he has pure in heart. It's extremely expanded. Was it what was in Q, what wasn't in Q? Matthew obviously has other tradition where he can expand this. But one of the things that Luke has right after that, but woe to you that are rich, like poor, no money, rich, money. Woe to you that are full now. Hunger, not hunger and thirst after righteousness, but hunger, like you don't have any food. You're full. You don't have, you eat a full meal 3 times a day or whatever. Woe to you that laugh now, for you will weep. And woe to you when men speak all well of you. So the blessings of Luke are followed by three woes. Is it three or four? No, four. One, two, three, four. Yeah. Whereas Matthew doesn't have that. So this is a problem with the two source tradition. It seems like Matthew, just like he did with the baptism, is taking a very tight core that Luke has. Blessing, 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 blessing. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, meaning, denouncing you. And it's very literal, like no money, no food, getting persecuted and so forth, and mourning. And he's more giving us spiritualized, you hunger and thirst for righteousness. So that would be unique to Matthew. So when you read the two source tradition, you have to get used to that. Now, here's another example, same thing. And notice what's happening. This is a trend. I didn't just pick these. I pick ones that are well known because people know the Beatitudes, they know the Lord's Prayer. So here's the Lord's Prayer. Luke, nobody ever quotes this, by the way. Jacob, when the King James translators came to Luke, they put in Matthew's prayer. Why? Because people would say, that's not the prayer. Everyone in the church had memorized, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom. To this day, this is the prayer. Matthew is the prayer. Okay. Luke has this staccato prayer, I call it. It's like, Father, hallowed be your name. Let your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive everyone who's indebted against us and so forth. And lead us not into temptation. So once again, Matthew is the more liturgical. I would also call this more liturgical. Notice what has gotten memorized and quoted in churches. I've never heard this quoted. I've heard it quoted in fragments where people would say, oh, we need to feed the hungry because Jesus said, blessed are the poor. Almost always, if anybody's memorized the Beatitudes in your audience, my guess is they know this. They don't know this by heart. You follow? Okay. And certainly they wouldn't know the woes by heart. So once again, Matthew is the liturgical gospel. He's expanding, he's embellishing, he's making it more spiritual in that sense, and elaborated and so forth. Now, this one is real. These are all the two source, just to show you. I'm trying to show you how Matthew handles material. If we assume there was a Q out there and we don't have it, we got two versions of the Q. My argument here is that Matthew's is probably not the original version of Q because he's constantly expanding and embellishing it, spiritualizing it, and making it more liturgical, which is a later kind of thing to do. Whereas Luke, even though I think he wrote later, just like he does with Mark, he seems to be more careful. Did you remember at the baptism, you are my beloved son, Mark? Luke, you are my beloved son. You see, Luke doesn't change things in Mark. He takes things out that he doesn't want to put in, like failure of the disciples. But Luke, if he's following what I think is the two source solution, this is going to be closer to what it was. Now, how do I know? Well, take a look at this. I can't tell you how many times growing up, I grew up in a church, an evangelical church. If anyone comes after me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Now, notice the rhetorical feel of that. Do you hear it? It's got this rhythm. You don't need to say again, cannot be my disciple. It reminds me of some of the ways that John Kennedy used to speak, and other great speakers that know how to ask questions, and notice if anyone comes to me, and then using the word hate. So what did I hear growing up? Some kid raises their hand in the back. Teacher, did Jesus mean we're supposed to hate our parents and family, right? Did you ever hear that? And what does the teacher say? No. It doesn't mean hate. It means to love God more. Okay. interpreted, right? Well, in the original version of Q, I think Q's not interested in making it easy. It's like poor, hungry, persecuted. And here it's like hate. Hate in Greek, miseo, means to hate. It is, I think it's hyperbole, but look what Matthew does. He immediately interprets it as what a Sunday school teacher would tell the kids. He who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his cross and follow is not worthy, and so forth. He doesn't even list. This has a ring. When I say who does not hate his own father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, even his own life. You hear the rhetoric there? It's like a drum beat. It's oral. Matthew's more, what did he say? Like, here's what he said. And Matthew's, what did he say? Boy, that's shocking. He said that you should love God more than your family. Oh, okay. I got that. See the difference? I don't think you go from this to this. I just can't see it. I do think you go from this problem and to this. Okay, here's another one. This isn't the same thing, but I want to show you how often Matthew, if Luke has three things, Matthew will just cut it to two. Because it's like, hey, we've made the point. Come on. So a scribe comes up to Jesus. I'll follow you wherever you go. He says, the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And then another said, Lord, let me go first and bury my father. I'm not going to stop and talk about what that means, but I think it has to do with waiting till my father dies. But anyway, or maybe the Yar site, because you have to pray for a year. And anyway, we won't get into that because I'm making another point. But Jesus said, follow me. Okay, here's Luke, same thing. Although he says, leave the dead to bury the dead. Notice Jesus said, follow me, leave the dead to bury the dead. Leave the dead to bury their own dead. As for you, proclaim the kingdom. And then another said, I will follow you, but let me first say farewell to those at my home. And he talks about, don't put your hand to the plow and look back. So this happens quite a bit where you will have Luke having three examples where Matthew just has two. Again, I think the way it's flowing is that Luke is the fuller, more original version, and Matthew's giving you more the synopsis. This one, I think, is really, really clear that way. If we start with Luke, notice the rhetoric, Jacob. Do you think that I've come to give peace on earth? Now, here I think you would pause and go, yeah, you're the Prince of Peace, right? And notice, no, I tell you, but rather division. For henceforth in one house there'll be five divided, three against two and two against three. They'll be divided. Why say it again? You just said they'll be divided. Say it again. It's rhetorical. It's got this pound to it. You see, it's like you're shouting it out. They will be divided: father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against their daughter-in-law, daughter-in-law. I mean, you can hardly read it with one breath. Okay, the point's the same, but look what Matthew puts. Don't think that I've come to bring peace. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's foes will be those of his own household. See, this summarizes all of this. This is rhetorical. This is edited. So I'm trying to demonstrate how Matthew works with a source that we have in terms of the two sources. Okay, here I'm just going to do the highlighted part. I didn't want to not give you the context, but just for sake of time.
Yeah.
I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have no more they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has power to cast into hell or Gehenna. Yes, I tell you, fear him. So just taking that verse, what is that? Notice the rhetorical part again, Jacob. I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have no more they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, You don't need to say that. Just say, you don't even need to say, I will warn you. He should just say this: do not fear those who kill the body but can't kill the soul, but rather fear him who can destroy body and soul in hell. See that? I call it the Cliff
No.
Notes. As you read the long version, that's rhetorical, orally powerful because it pounds home with these repetitions that aren't needed for the meaning. And then I always picture it like Luke's Jesus talks, and then somebody in the crowd goes, what did he just say? Give me the summary. I didn't hear all that. Oh, he said, don't fear men, fear God. Oh, okay, thanks. See?
Yeah.
That's his tendency. Okay. Now, this one is too long to go word for word, but we'll leave it up on the screen. And here we have a man being brought to Jesus. I'm going with mark and priority. So look how, and notice the size of the print. Look how long this is. Great detail. You know how people say, well, Mark's a cut down version of Matthew. This is a cut down version of this. I believe this would be the long version. This would be the cut down version. So what happens is people don't get the parallel, and notice Matthew's the one who cuts down Mark. He also, you saw in the Q source, he cut down, I've come to bring not peace, but a sword. Who hate your father, mother, and so forth. He's the reducer, he's the summarizer. This is the best example in the entire synoptics, I think. This is one of the longest stories. It's so long, I'm not going to read it. But it's basically Jesus is in a house at Capernaum, and it's so crowded, they can't get in, and they have to go on the roof and let a guy down. 4 men carrying a pallet, and they break the roof open. It comes down, and finally Jesus sees their faith because he got to the front of the crowd, and he says, son, your sins forgiven, and people object. And then he says, oh, well, I have authority to forgive sins. Here, how about this? Rise and walk. And the guy gets up and so forth. Okay, so look, Luke has all of that too. So this is telling me that when Luke has a source, he tends to keep it, right? When Matthew has a source, he tends to summarize it. It's very clear. So look at this. They brought to him a paralytic. Doesn't say it's in a house. Doesn't say anything about the roof. Doesn't even say the crowd. And he says, they brought him a paralytic, and he goes, your sins are forgiven. It's so different that some people think it could even be a different story. But when you start looking at the parallels, they're so close that it has to be the same story. And if you follow through Mark, this is where he is. When Matthew is rewriting Mark, this is where you are in this narrative of Mark. So it's clearly the same story. So why doesn't he expand it? Because all he really cares about is Jesus has the authority to forgive sins. Remember the last verse of Matthew? All power and authority is given to me on heaven and on earth. That's what Matthew cares about. You say, well, wasn't it crowded that day and they had to go to a lot of... Yeah, but that's not what I'm telling. I'm telling you that Jesus can forgive sins. And if only God can forgive sins, Jesus is some form of divinity. Okay. Same thing here. Notice the size of the print. But here, Matthew doesn't reduce because he wants to expand it for theological reasons. If you remember this is picking grain on the Sabbath. It's a Markan story. Matthew and Luke both have it because I think they're following Mark. I agree with Mark and priority. In Mark, let me just summarize the story, and people can read it. I'll put it down where you can read it later while you're listening. In Mark, they're picking grain on the Sabbath. Again, we're not going to get into the halakhic stuff of Judaism about that. That's a different subject, like what was wrong with that. But it's basically doing work. They're threshing, right? And they didn't prepare the meal ahead of time, which you're supposed to do. So 2 counts against them. And notice what Jesus says. He goes, oh, really? So you say they're breaking the law, huh? See, he's almost like a jokester. Well, let me see. I think in the Hebrew Bible, David broke the law. So I guess it's good to break the law because David's good, right? Now, why did David break the law? Human need. If you read the story of how he went into the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and took the holy bread that only the priests could eat, and it strictly says in the Torah that nobody else can eat that. I don't know if it says there's a death penalty, but it's really strong. Like, you cannot eat this bread. David's not a priest. These are troops. They're not priests. Goes and gets the bread. Why? Because they're so famished from walking in the desert that they're going to faint and die. And that can happen. I've been out in the desert where I have to be really careful. Anybody that's worked in the desert knows you don't have the right food and water, you can get in real trouble within an hour or two. So anyway, and then he says, the Sabbath is made for people. I'm going to say people instead of man. This is the RSV. The Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Notice he puts in a new story about the priest's work. The priests work on the Sabbath, okay? And he says, why do they work on the Sabbath? Because of the temple. They're serving the temple. But a greater than the temple is here. So the reason it's okay is because Jesus is so great. Again, the authority of Jesus. They're serving him, and he's greater than the temple. Therefore, they can do what they want on the Sabbath if they're serving him. See the idea? And then he takes out the Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath, because that kind of opens up a situational ethics idea that's just a little bit too tough for him. And even Luke takes that out because I think he's like, whoa, you know. So there he apparently is more interested in Matthew's version. Let's see. This is a case where you got to ask, does it go this way or does it go this way? This is the confession of Peter and Mark and Matthew, where Jesus asks, who do people say that I am? And I present in the Mark course that Peter, when he rebukes Jesus and says, get behind me. I mean, he says, no, you can never do that. And Jesus rebukes him and says, get behind me, Satan. It's pretty rough. I think Peter has a false understanding of Jesus in Mark. Here, Matthew sees that and he doesn't really take it out, but he puts a blessing of Peter. Look, blessed are you, Peter. Like, you do understand and God's revealed it to you. Mark is like, I don't think you're getting it. And he rebukes him and says he's on the side of Satan. So this is when Matthew reads Mark, he's like, whoa, this is pretty tough. And didn't Peter later believe and become the leader of the 12? So, be better to go ahead and reflect that. Let's see. This one's one of my favorite. In Mark, James and John, sons of Zebedee, come forward and ask to sit on the right and left hand. And notice in Matthew, it's the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Now, this would be a good example of harmonization. If you harmonize, you just say, well, James and John wanted to do it, and their mom went up and did it for them. Put it together. But this mitigates the guilt of the brothers, by saying the mother asked for it rather than they asked for it. And also, if you keep reading, there's this whole idea about don't even ask that, because if you're the first, you're going to be the last. And if you're the last, you're going to be the first, and so forth. This one is very interesting as far as Mark and Matthew together. This is the only guy in Mark commended for understanding the kingdom. The only guy. In fact, I think he's the only one in Mark that's commended for understanding anything. Others are commended by faith, and the poor widow for sacrifice, giving all she has. Remember the two mites? Guess what? Look at Matthew. He has a guy come, but it's to test him. And basically says, what is the great commandment? And Jesus tells him, and that's it. He's not commended for any understanding. Here, you get the whole key to the Markan gospel. When the scribe says, you are right, teacher, you've truly said that he is one, God is one, and there's no other, the Shema, and to love him with all the heart and all the understanding and all the strength, and love one's neighbor as yourself, is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And what does Jesus say? You're not far from the kingdom of God. Look what's missing here. Because Matthew doesn't want to show any Pharisees or scribes that had an understanding. And he's certainly not going to make them the hero of his book. I mean, this guy is actually the key to the book of Mark, because he says you're not far from the kingdom. Well, what's the kingdom? Well, if this guy's not far from the kingdom, it must have to be it has to do with an understanding of what God really wants, right? Love your neighbor, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And that would bring the kingdom. So once again, Jacob, I don't see this being the original and then Mark completely rewrites it and makes up a hero. I see this as being the original, and Matthew says, okay, that guy might have been one that was good, but I'm not telling that story because we're being persecuted by the Pharisees and Sadducees. That's why we generally think Matthew's from the 80s, because there's a lot of persecution of the Jesus movement by the Pharisees that have survived Jerusalem. Here we see Mark and Luke. I didn't put Matthew, but notice on the prayer in Gethsemane, look how long this is. 3 times Jesus asked the disciples to watch with him and pray. 3 times they fall asleep. Look at Luke. In Luke, he just says, pray that you may not enter into temptation. He withdrew, he prayed. When he arose, he came to his disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. That's not really a failure. They're just tired, maybe, Here, it's just, and if this was only here, and I only picked one example, Luke removes the rebuke of Peter that we've referred to early, get behind me, Satan, takes that out. He basically takes out all the misunderstanding of the disciples. In Mark in chapter 6, when he says, you don't understand this parable, how are you going to understand any parable? Takes that out. Chapter 7, he takes out. Chapter 8, when they're in the boat, he takes that out. And so you can see how they're being revised. And finally, the ending. Everybody knows this. Who would write a gospel and have appearances of Jesus, Mary Magdalene at the tomb and everything? And then if you keep reading, going to Galilee, seeing Jesus, and then we have the ending of Mark, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had come upon them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That alone demonstrates to me that Mark is first. First of all, he doesn't have the virgin birth or any of that, birth of Jesus. He just had Jesus show up. If you knew the virgin birth tradition that is so important to early Christians to believe in Jesus as the divine Son of God, born of a virgin, no human father, you would leave that out. Mark leaves it out. You knew that Jesus, the tomb was empty, but then just a few hours later, he shows up and appears to the disciples and eats with them. And according to Luke, for 40 days, he's in and among them, eating with them and so forth. Again, embellishment, reinterpretation, turning something more liturgical, mitigating the pointedness of some statements. I didn't put the poor widow in, but Matthew takes her out, and it's one of the greatest stories. And I think it's because right after the disciples go, look, Master, what beautiful buildings. And he's just told them, these buildings don't even matter. When the scribe goes, this is more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifice. You picture him waving his hand to all this stuff we're doing in the temple doesn't even matter. The temple can go. And Matthew's like, wait a minute, take that out. Okay, so that's the last slide. I'm going to stop this share and we can just you basically got the point. So the idea would be that if I look at Q, I see Matthew taking Luke's version, which I think is more original, and interpreting it, dulling the pointedness of it, like hate your father, mother, brother, sister, making it less rhetorical. It seems to be a rewritten version for his audience. And if I look at Mark, and we do have Mark as the source, Q we don't have, we just have Luke, but with Mark, we have Mark. So it's not like we have to wonder what would he do with the Markan passage. We can see what he does with the Markan passage. And what does he invariably do? Shorten it to the main point or expand it if he has a different point. So picking ground on the Sabbath, if you say the Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath, I'm going to translate that into God's laws are for people, for human good. And so if something's not for human good, it's not, don't follow it. Well, that could lead to situational ethics. Like somebody says, I will not lie. And I always use extreme examples. So Anne Frank is hiding from the Nazis in Amsterdam in the attic, right? Everybody knows the story, the die of Anne Frank. And the Nazis knock on the door. And this is a good Christian couple sheltering. They don't believe in lying. And they go like, someone said in the neighborhood that you have Jews maybe in your attic. You go, man, I can't lie because, it's it's a sin to lie. So yeah, we would have never told you, but you've asked us, we got to tell the truth. They're upstairs, go get them. Of course they're not going to do that. They're going to go, oh no, in fact, we don't even like Jews. They're going to lie to protect life. Okay, well, that's Mark. Laws are for people, not people for laws. So how do you decide how to keep the Sabbath? Whatever promotes human good. And the Sabbath, many who observe the Sabbath will tell you on many levels, and everybody kind of observes it. It's called the weekend, where you go, thank God it's Friday and so forth. We all need rest. And there's this sort of 7-day cycle that our culture has. And we need to take breaks. We call it vacation, vacate. That's the word Sabbath, to have a rest. So, but let's say you're in a situation where it's not going to cause rest or peace or tranquility. Like somebody's attacking you on the Sabbath. You say, well, can't defend myself because, got to keep the Sabbath. That happened, as you know, in First Maccabees, where they figured out these Jews, one day they won't fight. Why don't we attack them on that day? Do you remember the Yom Kippur War, 1973, October? It's the one time that most Jews in Israel go to the synagogue, even if they're secular. I mean, their mom and dad's go, come on, it's Yom Kippur, at least go with us on the holiest day of the Jewish year. So everybody's there fasting. And what happens? I think 5 or 6 nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, attack Israel. I'm smiling just because it's like making the point that they're going to be really caught off guard. So the Mark II thing would say, well, obviously as Israel did, forget Yom Kippur, you go fight the war. And yes, you're going to eat something because you're going to need some strength. But it says in the Torah that whoever eats anything will be cut off from the people. Then fine, cut me off, because I'm going to go, defend my family and my homeland. So you get the point. I think I find it very convincing. I have gone through for years now, taking this book here. In fact, I've owned this very book for 30 years and looking at every example. And there are a few problems. Mark Goodacre mentions some. He holds to Markan priority, but he's not convinced of Q as a separate document. I'm very fond of Robert Lindsay's idea that you might find embedded in Luke not only a more original Q, the 2 source, but things around it that could have been a gospel that even would have preceded Mark. Now, there won't be any Mark in it by definition, because we're talking about, there's the 2 source that we can extract is not all of it. Like I showed you the 3 examples of, I want to follow you. So you would add that. The woes are not in Matthew, you would add that. And I have done that, actually. If you want to see it, you can go to my website, jamestabor.com. and it's called Restoring the Original Gospel of Q. And I've created about a 20-page, it was a graduate course I did years ago, and everyone in the class, we had about 8 students, their whole job at the end of the class was try to recreate Q as Luke knew it, not just what Matthew used, but compare them carefully and see if you can figure out. And, people came up with different things, but it was surprising how similar. And I published mine because I did it as the teacher, just because everybody else has to do it. So I have to do it too. And I'm going to teach more on that in the future, but who knows, it might be something that is earlier than Mark. And if so, it wouldn't just be a collection of the sayings of Jesus. It would actually be the earliest gospel account. And then we've got to look at Marcion, which you know all about in your guests. So, and we can't do that today. But anyway, I hope that gives people a summary. You can go back to the slides, think about what I said. I hope a lot of times when you talk real fast, I was trying to hurry and get it within an hour. You'll say Matthew when you made Mark, or Mark when you made Matthew, but you'll be able to figure out what I was saying. I think generally I said it correctly, but a couple of times the slides were switched around. But those are the characteristics that I see. Do you have any questions, or you just want to let people digest it? And we could do a question and answer sometime in the future,
Oh yeah, I like that very
like
much. I
super
want
chats where people could come on and say, well, what about this? Like you said this, and yeah,
a market priority makes a great deal of sense to me.
does it? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'm still persuaded by it. I never, I don't recall unless I
Well,
misspoke
we
somewhere.
want to
But
listen to all of the views. I think Lindsay's complicated, but I just admire him so much because he was so fluent in Hebrew. He studied with David Flusser at Hebrew University. He got that whole school of Jerusalem research, Dwight Pryor and all of these guys. There's a bunch of them with PhDs. They're really sharp. Randy Booth. I'm not going to try to name them all because I'll miss some of them, but I think they have a different way of explaining Q and Mark and priority, but it has to do with something Luke used kind of emerging first, and then the other material developing. But I definitely can't see Mark coming from Matthew. Could I be convinced that Mark came from Luke? You could see how sometimes they're pretty close. You could make a better case from that Mark is getting his from Luke. But I think for me, it fails time and time again, because even though Luke follows Mark more closely, he also at times does not want what Mark has and just takes it out. Did you know he removes 3 chapters of Mark at one point? 645 through 1814 of Mark. Mark 645 through 1814, just gone. It's such a scissors job that people even said, you think his copy could have been missing some pages? But they didn't have pages. It's a papyrus. It's not a codex. Back in the 1st and 2nd centuries, codex doesn't come into late 3rd, early 4th centuries. So it's not pages like you could lose. Well, look what goes on in 645 through 814. Hammering the disciples over and over again for not understanding. And even saying things like, you don't understand, then how are you going to understand anything? And then rebuking them. And then the other rebukes of the disciples in chapter 8 of Mark, chapter 9 of Mark, and chapter 10 of Mark, he takes all those out. See?
so when you look at the double tradition passages and Matthew and Luke, as you've pointed out during today's discussion, Luke most of the time preserves what is thought to be in Q, and there's only a few occasions where he might embellish. And Matthew's the one that's typically embellishing almost all the time.
He's embellishing, or he's shortening sometimes because it's he just has, like the paralytic.
Hmm.
He doesn't embellish, he shortens it. So it depends on, you could always tell which way it's going to go. If it's a long drawn out story, but the main point is Jesus can forgive sins because he's God, who can forgive, then you don't need to embellish, just hammer that in. But if it's something that's offensive, like hate your mother, father, and also mentioning so many relationships, like, do you have to name every possible relationship? Can't you just say your family? And that's what he does. He said, love God more than your family. You don't have to name every your mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, son-in-law. And then he adds liturgical kinds of things, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, and the Beatitudes. So he really does three strategies, three different strategies. He removes things that trouble them. He adds things that can soften things that trouble him or shift them, like, you are Peter, you are blessed. When in Mark, he's far from blessed. He's, if anything, cursed. I mean, if you say, get behind me, Satan, that's kind of an epithet, get behind me, Satan. Like, you're representing the forces of evil, go away from me. And he says, you're not on the side of God, but of men. To Peter? And he just said, blessed are you, Peter, for revealing this to you. So I know, look, people can apologetically defend anything. It's actually pretty easy. You just think of different harmonious possibilities. Like, if I was trying to harmonize, I would say, well, he blessed him for the confession, but then Peter didn't understand the sufferings. Like that. But what you've just done is lost Mark, and you've lost Matthew, because if you read one or the other, you're not going to get both. You're not going to get both stories. Luke just takes it out. I think that pretty well shows that he's like, I'm not going to go there. He doesn't have any rebuking of Peter or get behind me, Satan. Because then he'd have to explain a lot of things, like, what? He just leaves it. So, but he doesn't add a blessing either. It's just the most fascinating thing. We are so enriched as scholars to have three ancient texts, probably all written within, I mean, some people go into the 2nd century with Luke and John, but within a 50, 75-year period, all about an ancient figure. Like, I took a course in grad school, The Life of Alexander the Great, and we have three sources. Richard Carrier's talked a lot about that. And we studied all three and did our comparisons of all the traditions and so forth. But they're far removed from one another. They're far removed from Alexander in time. So you got pseudo-Callisthenes and things like that. And it just doesn't allow us to do what we can do with this, because there seems to be this tight literary relationship. That's why people get so fascinated with it. I mean, you get really, really smart people wrestling with this because it's just this puzzle. Three ancient texts that are overlapping and related, but can you figure it out? And I feel pretty satisfied with where I've come on that, but always willing to listen.
What do you think of the idea that Mark might have been familiar with Q himself? Like when, for example, he brings up the Beelzebul
Yeah.
a thing
He
briefly.
certainly knows some language and traditions that are in Q, or the two source, let's call it. Maybe they're floating around or something. In my imaginary scenario, he does know Q. It's circulating. He's read it. It's important. It's out there. And he thinks, well, Q is good. We have Q. So picture, in this hand, I have the sayings of Jesus. We don't really have the story of Jesus, the narrative. And there's a story to be told there, that he was not accepted by the people. He was not accepted by his disciples. And he did not just preach glory and power and authority. He also preached rejection and forsakenness. So I think we need that story as well. So I could see how he would sit and compose the story, knowing that people had been reading the sayings. I can't prove that, but if you put it at 50, And again, how do you put Q at 50? Well, partly because it doesn't have any of the later theological stuff. It really doesn't. And of course, there can be layers of Q as well. I haven't read Dennis McDonald's new book. I've ordered it. Hasn't come yet. I don't know if I need to go check my Amazon order, but I've heard him talk about it. He's putting his whole thing together. And I do know that he says that he thinks he's just really solved the Q problem. And there are other scholars out there now that are still working on this and coming up with various things. So I'm going to enjoy, now that I've finished my teaching career as far as classroom teaching in a university, to have time not just to teach students, what I've done for years, but to read some of these other works. You've had some of the people on that I'm interested in reading. Because I want to know, more, and I want to learn, and I want to change if I'm wrong. So ask me in a year what I think. I'll have time to read up on things. So, like I did that Q&A thing a Sunday with the Mark course students. We did a 2-hour Q&A by Zoom, and one of them asked me, see, what was it? What was I thinking of? One of the questions. Now I've lost my train of thought because I was thinking ahead here. What did I just say before a minute ago? Oh, there's a scholar, maybe you know him, that has dated Mark to the Bar Kokhba period. And I'm thinking, I think it's around 70. But I hadn't read that. He mentioned an article.
I think you're referring to Marcus Vincent.
Might
Because
It
this
was
is
another name than that, but maybe several people are doing it.
this is the idea that the four gospels were
Posts.
composed simultaneously just after Marcion published his gospel in the Bar
Yeah,
Kokhba period.
okay. That could be it. It might be connected to other things as well. But I'm pretty standard in my, approach. And what I presented today is kind of a core for me. It works. It's convincing to me. But I would like to look into those things and see. That's why I mentioned Marcion at the end. So
Yeah, I recently had Marcus's PhD student on my channel, Jack Bull.
Oh
And
yeah.
he
Yes.
also subscribes to that. You might be
Yeah.
talking about him.
No, it was another name, but it sounds like there's a bunch of people thinking about this. Yeah.
Yeah.
So okay, well, I hope this is enlightening, and to your people. You have a great audience. I follow your channel and hope people will subscribe and keep up. And you've got just a wealth of depth in all your videos. I mean, I can't think of anything you haven't covered. And I like that you have people like Jack, that might not be giving you the standard theory, but something not just new, but that's very plausible. Maybe, who knows? Let's relook at this material. A lot of the stuff I presented today was developed by 1850. So you could say, well, Tabor, you're really out of date. But we've refined it over the years. And Mark Goodacre is somebody that I admire a great deal. And you might have had him on before, I don't know. But
Yeah, I've had him on a couple of times.
But he and I don't agree on Q. I do see it as an independent circulating document. So
yeah.
But I'm willing to have Luke know Matthew and so forth. So okay, well, thank you for having me.
Of course.
We've had to postpone this a few times, but we finally got it done.
Yep.
Okay, take care, Jacob. See you later.
Bye-bye. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.